Somewhere beneath the cold water of Lake Superior, and scattered across the islands that rise out of it, there are holes in the ground. Thousands of them. Pits dug straight down into solid rock, some of them deep enough to swallow a grown man standing on another man's shoulders. When the first European surveyors stumbled onto them in the 1800s, they assumed they had found old French or Spanish diggings. They were wrong by thousands of years. These pits were carved out by people who left behind no written language we have ever found, no great cities we have ever excavated, and no name that we know they called themselves. And yet they kept digging in the same places, using the same back-breaking methods, for somewhere close to 6,000 years. Then the work stopped, the pits filled with water and rotting leaves. The hammerstones were left lying exactly where they fell, as if an entire workforce had walked off the job one ordinary afternoon and simply never come back. And here is the part that keeps people awake. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Nobody can fully agree on where all the copper went. This is one of the oldest large mining operations on the entire planet. Older than the pyramids of Giza. Older than Stonehenge. Older, by some measurements, than the Bronze Age that supposedly handed humanity its very first taste of worked metal, and almost nobody outside of a few dusty academic papers has ever heard about it. So let's go back to the beginning, and let's try to figure out what actually happened up there on the lake. To understand any of this, you first have to understand the copper itself, because there is genuinely nothing else like it anywhere else on Earth. Most copper on this planet is locked inside rock as ore. To pull the metal out, you have to crush that rock, heat it past 2000 degrees, and chemically tear the copper away from everything it's chemically bonded to. That process is called smelting, and it is one of the hardest things ancient people ever learned how to do. It took our species tens of thousands of years of trial and error to crack it. But around Lake Superior, the copper isn't trapped inside ore at all. It sits in the ground as pure native metal. Veins of it running through the bedrock, sheets of it pressed between layers of stone, nuggets the size of your fist, and in a few astonishing cases, slabs as big as a car. One single mass that was later dragged out of the Ontonagon River weighed more than a ton and was nearly pure copper, soft enough that you could shave curls off it with a sharp blade. The Keweenaw Peninsula, that long, crooked finger of land jutting out into the lake, sits on top of the largest deposit of native copper known anywhere in the world. We are talking about metal that is ready to use the moment you free it from the rock. No furnace, no chemistry, no 2000-degree fire, just brute force and patience. So how did all of it get there in the first place? The answer reaches back to fire deep inside the planet. More than 1 billion years ago, a giant rift tried to tear North America in half right through this region. The rift failed, but as it pulled apart, it let molten rock pour up from below, and as that rock slowly cooled, mineral-rich fluids filled the cracks and seams with pure copper. Then, much later, the great ice sheets of the Ice Age ground across the land, scraping up chunks of that copper and dragging them south, dropping them in riverbeds and soil across the whole region. The miners who came along thousands of years afterward were, in a sense, harvesting a treasure that 2 separate geological catastrophes had spent eons preparing for them. Loose nuggets sitting in streambeds are called float copper, and the easy pieces would have been the first to go, picked up off the ground long before anyone ever thought to dig. And that single fact changes everything, because it means a society did not need to invent metallurgy to start using metal here. They just needed to find it, dig it out, and beat it into shape, which is exactly what somebody did, again and again, for thousands of years. Now, for a long time, the standard story said this mining began around 6,000 years ago. That number is where a lot of the legend comes from. But in recent decades, scientists started pulling sediment cores out of the lakes near these ancient pits, looking for traces of pollution. Mining leaves a chemical fingerprint. When you dig and hammer copper, Tiny amounts of metal wash into nearby water and settle into the mud, layer by layer, year by year. What those sediment cores showed stunned the researchers. The contamination didn't start 6,000 years ago. It started closer to 9,500 years ago. That would make the copper workers of Lake Superior some of the earliest metal workers on the face of the planet, going at it at roughly the same time as the very first metal users of the ancient Near East, and possibly even earlier. People in North America were shaping metal tools, while most of the world was still chipping away at stone. Sit with that for a second. The textbook version of history tends to treat the Americas as a place where advanced tool-making arrived late. And here is a chunk of evidence, sitting in lake mud, quietly arguing the opposite. So who were they? The honest answer is that we are not entirely sure. Archaeologists gave them a careful, deliberately boring name. They call them the Old Copper Complex, or the Old Copper Culture. It's a label of convenience for a group of people we mostly know through the objects they left behind, because they did not build in stone and they did not write anything down. But the objects are extraordinary. They made knives, spear points, fish hooks, awls, chisels, harpoons with wicked little barbs, bracelets and beads and ornaments worked so finely that they look almost modern. Tens of thousands of these copper artifacts have been pulled out of the ground across the western Great Lakes region, and that is just the ones we have found. The real number that once existed is anyone's guess. The technique they used was something called cold hammering, often combined with a trick called annealing. They would take a lump of native copper and pound it flat with a stone. The metal hardens as you hammer it, getting brittle, so they would then heat it in a fire to soften it again, then hammer some more. Heat, hammer, slowly coaxing a shapeless nugget into a perfectly balanced spear point. It is slow, demanding, skilled work. The kind of work you only get good at over generations. Think about what that really means for a second. A skill like this cannot be invented in an afternoon. It has to be taught, hand to hand, parent to child, master to apprentice, across hundreds of human lifetimes. Somebody had to learn exactly how hot to make the fire so the metal softened but did not crack. Somebody had to learn how many blows a fresh nugget could take before it grew brittle and needed reheating. Somebody had to learn the feel of a good hammerstone in the hand, the angle of the strike, the rhythm of the work. All of that knowledge lived only in memory and muscle, passed down through an unbroken chain of teachers for thousands of years. When you hold one of their spear points and turn it in the light, you are not just holding a piece of metal. You are holding the final product of a tradition older than almost any other craft on Earth. And the mining itself? That was even harder. Picture the scene. You are standing on a rocky ridge on Isle Royale, a remote island far out in the lake, thousands of years ago. You have found a vein of copper running into the bedrock. You have no iron tools, because iron working hasn't been invented anywhere near here. You have no explosives. You have stone and fire and your own two hands, so you build a fire directly on top of the rock. You let it burn hot, baking the stone until it's scorching. Then you throw cold lake water onto it. The sudden shock cracks the rock, splitting it along weak points. Then you grab a hammerstone, a rounded cobble that might weigh 10 or 20 pounds, and you smash at the fractured rock for hours, prying loose chunks, chasing the copper vein deeper and deeper. These hammerstones are everywhere up there. Archaeologists have counted them by the thousands. Many of them are broken, shattered from the sheer force of the pounding. Some of the pits the miners left behind go down 20-30 feet. A few reportedly went deeper, all of it dug by hand, fire and water, and this was not a quick job. The big island sites were almost certainly seasonal. The lake freezes hard in winter, and the conditions out there are brutal. So the most likely picture is of people travelling to the copper grounds in the warmer months, setting up camp, working the veins for weeks at a time, then carrying their haul back to wherever they spent the winter. Year after year, the same long migration, the same camps, the same exhausting climb up to the same ridges to reopen pits their grandparents had started. Some of those pits show signs of being worked, abandoned, and reopened across enormous stretches of time, as if the location of every good vein was knowledge handed carefully down the generations like a family inheritance. This was an operation measured not in months or years, but in millennia. On Isle Royale alone, surveyors mapped thousands of these ancient pits. The Keweenaw Peninsula was riddled with them too. When 19th-century mining companies arrived to start their own industrial copper operations, they made a habit of looking for the old pits first, because the ancient miners had already located the best veins. In a strange way, the modern copper boom of Michigan was guided by the ghosts of people who had done the exact same job thousands of years earlier. There is something genuinely haunting about that. The men who blasted Michigan copper out of the rock in the 18 and 1900s, men with steam drills and dynamite and railroads behind them, were often just following directions left by people they would have dismissed as primitive. The old workings were treasure maps written in stone, and in more than a few cases the modern miners broke into ancient pits and found the tools still lying there: hammerstones, wooden levers, copper masses half freed from the surrounding rock and then, for reasons nobody recorded, simply left behind, untouched for thousands of years, sitting exactly where the last ancient worker had set them down before walking away. And that brings us to the central mystery, the one that has launched 100 wild theories. How much copper did they actually take out of the ground? This is where things get slippery, and this is where you have to be careful, because this single question is the seed of almost every strange story told about Lake Superior. Some early estimates, made by people who were frankly more enthusiastic than rigorous, claimed that the ancient miners removed hundreds of millions, even billions of pounds of copper over the millennia. Those numbers got repeated and exaggerated and repeated again until they took on a life of their own. It really helps to understand where those giant numbers actually came from. Back in the 1800s, when the old pits were first being studied, a handful of enthusiastic observers tried to estimate the total amount of copper removed by counting visible pits and guessing at their depths. Their methods were loose, their assumptions generous, and their conclusions enormous. Those early guesses got copied into books, then into magazine articles, then into the early days of the internet, and each retelling rounded the figure up just a little more, until numbers that were shaky to begin with hardened into supposed fact. By the time they reached a modern audience, they had become almost mythological. The trouble is that a guess repeated 1,000 times is still just a guess, and a large share of the so-called missing copper was never actually proven to have existed in the first place. Then someone asked the obvious follow-up question. If they really pulled that much copper out of the ground, where is it? Because here is the uncomfortable gap. The amount of copper found in actual Native American artifacts across North America, while substantial, does not come close to matching the most extreme estimates of how much was supposedly mined. So a hole opens up in the story, a missing copper hole. And nature, along with the human imagination, hates a vacuum. This is the moment where the history splits into two very different roads. Down one road, you have the mainstream archaeologists, who will tell you the extreme mining estimates were always exaggerated, that the real volume was far smaller, and that the copper is exactly where you'd expect it to be, spread through countless artifacts and trade goods across the continent over thousands of years. We'll come back to them, because their version has a lot going for it, but down the other road you have a far more dramatic idea. An idea that has electrified amateur historians, fringe researchers, and a whole online subculture for decades. The idea is simple, and it is audacious. What if the copper left the continent entirely? What if it crossed an ocean? To understand why anyone would even propose something so bold, you have to look at the other side of the world, and at a problem historians have genuinely argued about for a long time. The Bronze Age. Roughly 5,000 years ago, civilizations across Europe and the Mediterranean and the Near East started producing bronze on a massive scale. Bronze is an alloy, mostly copper with a little tin mixed in. And bronze was everything. Weapons, armor, tools, art, currency. Entire empires ran on it. The demand for copper during the Bronze Age was enormous, almost insatiable. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And some researchers have asked, with real puzzlement, whether the known copper mines of the ancient world were truly enough to supply all of it. There are debates about the chemical signatures of certain Bronze Age artifacts, debates about isotope ratios, debates about whether some of that metal came from sources nobody has fully identified. There is a real scientific tool sitting at the center of this debate, and it's worth understanding. Copper from different deposits carries slightly different chemical and isotopic signatures, a kind of geological fingerprint baked in when the metal first formed. By measuring those signatures, scientists can sometimes trace an ancient artifact back to the region its metal came from. Some researchers have pointed out that certain Bronze Age objects carry signatures that are difficult to match cleanly to the known European and Near Eastern mines. Most experts believe the answer lies in undocumented or understudied Old World sources, or in the constant recycling and mixing of metal that smudges any clean reading. But the Fringe theorists seized on those hard-to-place results and pointed straight across the Atlantic. The science, so far, does not support that leap. The chemical fingerprint of Lake Superior copper has not turned up convincingly in the Bronze Age artifacts of Europe, but the simple existence of the debate is what keeps the door cracked open just wide enough for the wilder stories to slip through. So the Fringe theory threads these two mysteries together into one spectacular claim. On one side of the Atlantic, a mountain of supposedly missing American copper. On the other side, a civilization burning through more copper than it should have been able to find. Connect those two dots, the theory says, and you get something incredible. You get a forgotten transatlantic trade route. Ancient ships, thousands of years before Columbus, crossing the open ocean to haul Michigan copper to the forges of the Old World. It's a thrilling idea, and in certain corners of the internet, it has fused with something even larger and stranger. In recent years, a sprawling alternative history movement has grown up online, often gathered under a single odd name borrowed from old maps, Tartaria. On those old maps, much of Central and Northern Asia was labelled with that word, Tartary, a vague catch-all term that map-makers slapped onto territory they barely understood. The modern movement took that historical curiosity and ran somewhere completely unexpected with it. The core claim of this movement, in its broadest form, is that there once existed a single, technologically advanced, globe-spanning civilization, a lost world empire with knowledge and capabilities far beyond what we credit ancient people with having. And, the theory goes, this civilization was somehow erased, wiped from the official record, its achievements stolen, reassigned or buried, leaving behind only scattered anomalies for the curious to find. You can probably already see how the Lake Superior copper fits into a story like that. A mining operation that is impossibly old. An industry that ran for thousands of years and then stopped cold. A pile of metal that, depending on whose numbers you trust, seems to have gone missing. To someone already convinced of a hidden global civilization, the ancient pits of Michigan look less like a mystery and more like a smoking gun. Proof, they argue, of an advanced ancient world that operated on a scale we have been taught to dismiss. Now, I want to be straight with you here, because you deserve that. There is no solid, accepted evidence that a lost super-civilization mined Lake Superior. There is no confirmed wreck of an ancient ocean-crossing copper freighter sitting on the seabed. The Tartaria framework, taken as a literal hidden empire, is rejected by essentially every working historian and archaeologist, and for reasons that are pretty hard to argue with. But I also think it's lazy to just laugh these ideas off and move on, because the reason they spread is that they're attached to a real and genuinely unsolved puzzle. The questions underneath the wild answers are good questions. Who were these people? Why did they mine for so unbelievably long? And why, after thousands of years, did they suddenly stop? So let's actually try to answer that last one, the disappearance. Because that, more than the missing copper, is the true heart of this story. For most of these thousands of years, copper at Lake Superior was a working metal. People made tools out of it. Practical things. Knives that cut, points that killed game, awls that pierced hide. The copper was useful, and so they used it. But then, starting roughly 3,000 years ago, something shifted. The archaeological record shows a clear change. People largely stopped making copper into everyday tools. Instead, copper became something else. It became precious, ceremonial, reserved for ornaments, for jewelry, for objects buried with the dead. The metal that had once been a hammer became a treasure, and the large-scale mining wound down. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic event, but it faded. The frantic activity in those pits slowed and eventually mostly stopped. The hammerstones were set aside. The fires went cold. Why? This is where serious researchers, the careful ones, actually have some compelling answers, and they're more interesting than any Lost Empire fantasy. One explanation is about trade and value. As trade networks across North America grew more sophisticated, copper from Lake Superior began moving enormous distances, traded from hand to hand across half a continent. Copper objects have turned up in burial mounds hundreds and even thousands of miles from the lake. And the further a thing travels, and the more hands it passes through, the more valuable and exotic it becomes. Copper may have simply become too precious to waste on something as mundane as a fishhook. It became a status symbol, a marker of prestige and spiritual power, the kind of thing a leader is buried with, not the kind of thing you lose in a river while fishing. And the evidence for that ordinary explanation is genuinely strong. Copper from the Great Lakes shows up in burial mounds scattered across the eastern half of the continent, carried by trading cultures who moved goods along rivers and trails over staggering distances. Seashells from the Gulf Coast traveled north. Obsidian from the western mountains traveled east. Mica, pearls, and worked stone all crisscrossed the continent, and Lake Superior copper traveled everywhere, ending up in graves and ceremonial sites 1,000 miles and more from the lake where it was dug. This was a continent laced with long-distance exchange, and copper was one of its most prized currencies. You do not need a fleet of transatlantic ships to explain where the metal went. You just have to follow the trade routes that the artifacts themselves quietly lay out for you, mound by mound, river by river, across thousands of years. Another explanation is about practicality. Cold-hammered copper is beautiful, but it is not actually superior to a well-made stone tool for a lot of everyday tasks. A finely knapped flint blade can be sharper than copper. Stone is everywhere and easy to replace. So once copper took on a higher social meaning, switching back to stone and bone for daily work wasn't a step backward. It was just sensible. There may have been bigger forces at work too. 3,000 years ago was a time of real change across North America. Climate patterns were shifting, populations were moving and growing, and brand new ways of living were taking hold across the continent. Some researchers suspect that as societies grew more complex and more focused on status, ceremony, and long-distance trade, the raw practicality of copper started to matter far less than what copper could say about the person who owned it. A copper knife is just a knife. A copper ornament buried alongside a respected leader is a statement about power, lineage, and the spirit world. The metal did not lose its worth when the mining slowed down. If anything, it gained a deeper kind of worth. It moved out of the everyday toolkit and into the realm of the sacred, and once it lived there, you simply did not need to tear thousands of fresh pieces out of the ground every single season. And here we arrive at the part of the story that almost everybody gets wrong, including, sometimes, the title of a video like this one. The people did not vanish. That is the great misunderstanding at the center of this whole legend. The phrase you hear over and over, vanished without a trace, paints a picture of an empty land, a ghost civilization that evaporated into thin air. But that is not what happened, and it matters that we get this right. The descendants of the old copper people did not disappear. They are the ancestors of native nations who still live in the Great Lakes region today, including the Anishinaabe peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and others. Their cultures continued, adapted, and endured through everything that came after, right up to the present day. The copper itself never lost its sacred meaning to them. For many Great Lakes nations, Copper from the lake remained a deeply spiritual material, tied to stories and ceremonies, long after the great mining pits fell silent. So what actually vanished was not a people. What vanished was an industry, and a particular way of using a particular metal. The miners didn't walk off into oblivion. They changed. Their relationship to the copper changed. And the reasons for that change are written, faintly but legibly, in the artifacts and the burial sites and the trade routes they left behind. That is a quieter answer than a sunken fleet of ancient copper ships. It does not come with a lost empire or a global conspiracy, but it has the considerable advantage of fitting the actual evidence, and yet the mystery does not fully close, does it? Because even the careful, evidence-based version still leaves you standing on the shore of Lake Superior, staring at thousands of hand-dug pits, holding a shattered 10-pound hammerstone that somebody set down in roughly the same era. The Great Pyramids were being raised, and feeling the sheer scale of it pressed down on you. 6,000 years, by the traditional count. Maybe more than 9,000 by the sediment cores. Generation after generation after generation, climbing the same ridges, lighting the same fires, swinging the same kind of stone against the same stubborn rock. We don't know what they called the lake. We don't know what songs they sang while they worked, or what they believed the copper was, or why exactly they wanted so much of it for so long. We don't have their names. We have the holes they left in the ground and the tools they dropped, and from that thin evidence we are trying to reconstruct an entire lost world of labor and meaning. That is the real reason the fringe theories find such fertile soil here. It isn't that the evidence points to a lost super-civilization. It's that the truth, the genuine archaeological truth, is itself so strange and so old and so quietly enormous that the human mind reaches for a bigger story to contain it. Confronted with something this vast and this silent, we would rather imagine a hidden empire than sit with the harder fact that ordinary people much like us, did something extraordinary and patient and almost unimaginable, and then let it go. So where does that leave us, standing here on the cold rock with the lake stretching out grey and endless in front of us? It leaves us with a few things we can say with confidence. People mined copper at Lake Superior for thousands of years, beginning astonishingly early in human history. They did it with fire, water, and stone, with no metallurgy and no metal tools of their own to start. They produced a staggering number of beautifully worked objects. The copper travelled across a continent through trade networks we are still mapping, and then, gradually, the metal transformed in their hands from a tool into a treasure, the mining faded, and the descendants of those miners carried their cultures forward into a future that is still unfolding right now. And it leaves us with the questions that no sediment core and no isotope study has ever fully answered: the exact size of the operation, the full story of where every ounce of copper ended up, the interior lives of people who left no words behind. Those gaps are real. They are not invented by conspiracy theorists. They are honest holes in human knowledge, and they may never be completely filled. Maybe that's the part worth holding on to. We live in an age that likes its history tidy, packaged, settled, sorted into confident textbook paragraphs. And then you go up to Lake Superior, and you find thousands of pits dug by hands that vanished into time, holding a kind of patience our restless century can barely comprehend, and you realize how much of the human story is still genuinely unknown, still waiting in the mud and the rock for someone to ask the right question. They mined that lake for 6,000 years. They did not vanish without a trace. They left a trace so vast and so old that we are still struggling to read it. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not where the copper went, but how something this enormous, this ancient, and this human could have been so completely, so casually forgotten. The pits are still there, the lake is still cold, and the rock still holds its secrets, waiting for the next person willing to climb the ridge and listen. Some stories survive precisely because they refuse to be proven, and this is one of them, so sit with it. The copper, the warning, the bright still pools in the dark. Then go and look at a map of those old pits, and ask yourself who really dug those pits.